So as shared, my name's Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm originally from the Bronx. So I'm currently based here in Brooklyn in New York, and I'm the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO, which is a 30-year-old global advocacy organization that was founded by a group of amazing, incredible activists from Dr. Vandana Shiva, Dr. Wangari Maathai, U.S. Congresswoman Bella Abzug, who were working and fighting different forms of crises, environmental crises, crises around peace and injustice, and who came together in the early 90s to look at the space of the Earth Summit, which was a global policy space at the time, looking at different environmental crises, and see not only were women not present in these spaces, but women's rights and voices and issues were not being framed in the context of the decision making that came out of there. And so in the context of the question that we've been asked here, a call for feminist leadership, I wanted to talk about just a few things. One is this work that I think as we do, and many of the groups on this has always centered, is trying to shift what leadership actually looks like. Because, as little as 10 years ago and even today, if you look at something like the climate change negotiations, or even if you look at the political makeup and representation of most countries, or even most boards that sit around some of the largest financial institutions in our world, they are certainly not representative of the world, let alone are they gender balanced. And I think as a fundamental first point of entry is understanding that having such a concentration of power in a very unequal and undiverse way is part of our systemic issues and part of our systemic challenges. And I wanted to, it was actually the government of Finland who really recognized this in the context of the UNFCCC, the climate change negotiations, over a decade ago. Because as was shared by the minister, there has been a lot of progress within Finland to ensure that gender equality is a key part of leadership because of the impacts that it has then on more equitable policy making. And so we've had the pleasure of working with the government of Finland, or had the pleasure for a number of years, on a project that specifically funded and supported and trained women negotiators, women diplomats and leaders in public policy to be negotiators in the climate change regime, particularly from least developed countries, to really try to shift that tide towards who is coming to these spaces and sharing the stories of impact and being given a mantle of leadership. And how do we change that so that those who are both most impacted by climate and who have the solutions are the ones who are seated at the table for decision making. And so I think that you have a lot of examples of work that's happening to center women in all their diversity, including grassroots and indigenous women, as decision makers in climate change negotiations, in local elections, in cities. And I think that's all very critical and important work. I think equally important when we're talking about what leadership looks like is this call for feminist leadership, and really breaking down what do we mean when we say feminist leadership. And for me, this is both what does feminist leadership look like from the individual, but also what does feminist collective leadership look like? Because for me to be in collective is really about a feminist ethic of care, and understanding that we have to actually really shift from the individual to the collective to really embody what feminist leadership is. The current status quo around the world is untenable for women and girls, and it's not working to create a livable and just planet for all. And I think, and the collectives that we work in see that building out intentionality in our agendas to ground them in feminist principles allow for a deeply important conversation around, frankly, the inadequacy of efforts so far to deliver on gender equality. And for us, that's because they're often delinked from systemic root causes, whether that's trade, corporate power, environmental destruction, or militarism. And so I think that part of what it means to build feminist leadership is grounding analysis of gender inequalities and power imbalances in those systemic root causes that actually cause oppression across multiple forms of intersection. I think we can see a lot of examples of leadership that is more feminist in nature, even, for example, in the response to the COVID crisis, where I've been particularly inspired by the health minister in Kerala, who is a former secondary education teacher, who has really and Kerala as a state as well have really invested in public education, and they've put public outreach, communication, care at the heart of their response, and are very much relying on a large workforce of women in particular in leadership positions to lead their response to this crisis. I also think you'll see this in the collectives that have been born over the last few years, and in feminist academics and epistemologies that have been around for decades now, which understand that real leadership from a feminist perspective needs to be intersectional and inclusive and built from a center of care. And so, Jackie and I are actually part of a coalition called the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal. I wanted to read for you one of the things that we outlined from the beginning was that a transformative feminist agenda centers the leadership of women. It acknowledges and addresses that the generational impacts of colonization and anti-Black racism. It must end oppression against and be led and articulated by frontline impacted communities, especially women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, LGBTQIAP+ people from the global South, migrant and refugee communities, and youth. And I think that the richness in a feminist leadership understands that deep importance of intersectionality, that we're not just fighting the oppression of patriarchy, we're also fighting oppression such as white supremacy. And I bring that into the conversation. I also want to bring the name of George Floyd into this conversation, because I came into this feeling really wrapped with the understanding at which so many different forms of oppression are actually shaping the crises that we're facing today. George Floyd was a victim of police brutality that was just killed last night. And, we have this is a crisis in the United States, but this is a crisis that you see around the world. And I think of the example that was just brought up about what sites, like indigenous sites, that are being lost to mining and coal and destruction. And those are often very not only gendered, but racialized in terms of who's facing environmental destruction. And so I think that in all of our analysis and our work, the centering of power is really, really important. And that's a critical piece. And I'm really pleased that this is a feminist climate conference, because it helps us understand why, when we are crafting policies, if we don't take that intersectional approach, and if we don't take that inclusive approach, where from the beginning we are bringing those who are facing the front lines of impacts and who have those solutions to the table in defining what policies should look like, we will inevitably create policies that are inequitable and exacerbate challenges that already exist. And so I think it's maybe become a sort of cliche catchphrase to say we need to center frontline leadership, but that's because there's real solution there. There's real evidence and data that shows that when we center frontline leadership, we do see the impacts of much more holistic, richly diverse policies that are centered in an ethic of care. And I think that as well as broader feminist agendas around creating peace and putting kind of people and planet at the center is part of why we need that push and shift towards a collective leadership. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. So it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Bridget, and I appreciate the organizers and all of the other other speakers that have preceded me. It is and it's a joy to be here with all of you who are out there in cyberspace listening to this important conversation. So just taking the baton from Bridget's remarks, in terms of that comment around when frontline women lead, we see the types of policy making, the types of practices, the types of systems that we need to advance the types of change that we need. We as a NAACP is a civil rights organization, and we find in our work that there are so many examples of campaigns where feminist principles of organizing around systems change were the key to success. And so to advance the true systems change that we need in the face of climate change, we have found time and time again that solutions must be rooted in feminist principles and practices. We view the work that we do through the intersecting lenses of race, gender, and other areas of strength, but also in our societal context of marginalization. So when we talk about environmental and climate justice, we know that in the face of cancer clusters, asthma clusters, and violence against women, as a result of disproportionate placement of toxic facilities in communities of color and low-income communities, that we have seen women of color rising into leadership to advance the changes that we need. We've chronicled the ways that women of color are disproportionately impacted by environmental justice, including climate change, and the ways that women are leading on systems change. We have several reports that we've come out with to really chronicle these challenges. In our cold-blooded report, we profiled mothers and grandmothers who were taking their children to the emergency rooms regularly, as African American children are 3 to 5 times more likely than white American children to enter the hospital from asthma attacks, and twice as likely to die of asthma attacks. In researching our report called Fumes Across the Fence Line, we found women who felt that they had no choice but to continue to reside in communities that had become toxic cancer clusters that brought harm to themselves, their families, and even their unborn children. In our allied work with groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network, we've also deepened our understanding of missing and murdered women along the pipelines and along the pipeline pathways and the man camps where men stay in oil fields and bring with them practices of trafficking and a drug trade that disproportionately harms Indigenous women. In our fossil-fueled foolery report, we found women leaders of organizations who struggle to keep their doors open and who are being pressured by fossil fuel companies to take money and effectively betray their own communities into being instruments of their own destruction. In our Lights Out in the Cold report, we highlighted single mother-headed households, and in the case of African American households, single-headed households, we have a wealth differential that is vast. The average wealth of a single African American woman is $5 compared to over $100,000 for white American women. And we found in that case that women were paying the price with their lives when heartless utility companies shut off their lights and or their heat in the reckless pursuit of profits. In our In the Eye of the Storm toolkit, we talked about the women who experience violence in the aftermath of disasters and women who disproportionately lose their lives endeavoring to protect their children through the many storms. In our upcoming paper, Immigration Justice is Gender Justice is Climate Justice, we talk about the many women we have encountered who have crossed the borders seeking sanctuary due to climate forced migration and have been harmed from trafficking and violence in so doing. But yet, as women of color, we still rise into leadership. In our recent reports of victory and leadership, such as Our Communities, Our Power, Resourcing Revolutionary Resistance and Resilience, Unbought and Unbossed, it's a blog series, and our upcoming Gender and Climate Justice report, we've profiled the countless examples of the triumph of feminist leadership. It's the feminist leadership of Joanne Hardesty and other women in Portland that led to the victory in Portland on the Clean Energy Fund, which is now a nationwide model of comprehensive programming. And now Joanne Hardesty has been elected into office as a city council to carry forth the mandates of that piece of legislation. It's the feminist leadership of Queen Ket of the Gullah Geechee Nation in St. Helena, South Carolina. She's creating the systems that are sustaining her community as they continue to be battered by the Atlantic storms and as they face encroaching sea level rise. It's the feminist leadership of Jilman Galiman of Got Green in Seattle, Washington, who is amassing a multi-ethnic coalition to win against gentrification and secure housing and security and more. It's the feminist leadership of Rawa Gurmat Zion at Push Buffalo and in Buffalo, New York, whose leadership is resulting in affordable housing, clean energy, and sustainable jobs. Stacy Long of the LGBTQ Health Task Force, recognizing we can't have climate justice without LGBTQ justice. Huda Alkaf of Green Muslims in Wisconsin, recognizing that healing justice is critical to climate justice. Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, leading the charge on racial justice. And then finally, in our Congress, it's the feminist leadership of Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley, otherwise known as the Squad, that's bringing a new way of thinking, acting, and policymaking to the halls of the United States Congress. So in closing, we recognize, as we link arms with other organizations that who are leading on feminist leadership, as Bridget talked about with the Feminist Green New Deal agenda and so forth, we recognize that transformational policies and practices must follow the leadership path of these awesome women who unbendingly recognize that climate change solutions must be community-led, and they must be uncompromising when it comes to resisting privatization, market-based solutions, and other false solutions. And finally, that any pathway to justice must advance a world that is built on feminist principles and practices of regeneration, cooperation, interdependence, deep democracy, and caring. So thank you very much. I'll pass it back to our moderator. Thank you.